the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. On this third Sunday of Pascha, we celebrate the myrrh-bearing women. And of course, we know that chronologically, the events that we celebrate this day actually come before what we celebrated last week, which was the doubting of Thomas. I've got to admit that I'm very, very fond of this feast because it tells us so much about discipleship. And it also tells us so much about human nature. The myrrh-bearers. These women, of course, are names that were known to us already before this event, before this resurrection event. We say resurrection event, but of course we know that for them, they thought they were going forward to do a funerary rite. They thought that they were going to use the spices, the aromatics, which they had bought in order to finally bury Christ properly. And of course, the story didn't turn out as they expected. And when we go through the myrrh-bearing women, their names are familiar to us because we've encountered them elsewhere in the Gospel. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joses, Mary the wife of Cleopas, Mary and Martha of Bethany, Joanna, Salome, Susanna, and of course we mustn't forget that the Mother of God herself was one of those myrrh-bearing women who went there in order to bury not simply the master, the teacher, the rabbi, but to bury her own son and the flesh of her flesh and the fruit of her own womb. And when we go through the Gospels, it tells us so much about this remarkable band of women. Mary Magdalene. Of course we say Magdalene, Mary of Magdala, of the place, Mary of the place called Magdala. She's mentioned 12 times in the Gospels. And in fact, she's mentioned more than anybody else, apart from the disciples. 12 times she pops up. And we learn from the Gospels that Mary is one of the women who supported Jesus, who used her own resources, who used what money she had in order to help Jesus, and who travelled around, who went around with the disciples. Very often we make the conclusion, therefore, that these women were women who weren't poor, who were in fact women of property, women of wealth. It doesn't mean this. We know in the history of the church of people who possessed very little, and yet they were willing to give their last farthing, their last halfpenny, in order to support the work of the gospel. Perhaps that was so with these women. And of course, famously we know, particularly from medieval art, that Mary Magdalene was the woman from whom Christ had cast out 7 demons. And if we go to Glastonbury Abbey and go into St. Patrick's Chapel, there on the back wall you actually see this painting of St. Mary Magdalene holding an alabaster jar of ointment, of precious spices, with representations of the 7 demons that had been cast out from her. And St. Luke, when he talks about Mary Magdalene, doesn't just mention her, he mentions others. He mentions Joanna, and he mentions Susanna. Now, interestingly, Joanna, perhaps she was a lady that had a little bit more wealth than the others, because we're told that her husband, Chuza, was a steward, like a butler, to King Herod Antipas. So we're talking about a civil servant, the wife of a civil servant in some ways. When we say about a steward, I suppose he managed the household as well. He had a position of responsibility. Ironically, perhaps, the wealth that came through a servant of Herod went to the buying of the sweet spices with which to bury Jesus. We have Mary, the mother of James and Joses, who's mentioned by St. Mark, and he's mentioned by St. Luke as well. Mary, the wife of Cleopas. She appears for us in St. John's Gospel, and we're told was present at the crucifixion, and that she was one of those who brought supplies for the funeral. And then Mary and Martha of Bethany. Quite special characters for us, because we get a little bit more of a picture of these women. Of course, famously, not so long before this event, when the women go in the end of the night, just before dawn, to take spices, we know that they had witnessed the raising of their own brother such a short time before, and that Jesus was clearly very familiar with their house. It was a place where Jesus was welcomed, where Jesus was fed, where Jesus met with his friends, where Jesus received their respect, their affection, and where, of course, Mary sat at the feet of Jesus, listening to what he had to say as he taught. Jesus, the rabbi, under the roof of Lazarus. Martha, of course, rushing around doing lots of things and slightly chiding the Lord, saying, "Why don't you tell my sister that she should be helping me instead of sitting there?" We see the contrast in these sisters, and we meet them again in the first Pascha morning when they're going to the tomb. Salome, the mother of James and John, is an interesting character. Not so much for what we're told about her in the scriptures, where she's mentioned, but by the fact that the church tradition sees that character in the bottom corner of the Christmas icon, who is washing the baby Jesus, to be the same Salome. Salome, according to the tradition of the church, was one of the daughters of Joseph the betrothed. If you like, a sort of stepsister to Jesus. And the church has her there right at the beginning of Christ's life, when as a human child, newly born, he was covered with blood and whatever else is involved in that birth. She was there, and then there she is, unknowingly and unwittingly going to a place of what is almost like a second womb of the cave and a second birth in Christ's resurrection. And then Susanna, another one of the women associated with Jesus' ministry, and among those listed by St. Luke in that chapter 8. These women had been there at the side of Jesus. We often forget to ask as we read the Gospels, who supported the disciples? Who did the washing? Who did the darning and the mending? Who cleaned? Who cooked? Who did all of those chores? Well, we have this great band of women that surrounded Jesus in his ministry and these disciples. And we can pretty much guarantee that these amazing women were involved in the everyday ministry of Jesus, and that they could be guaranteed to be there, to do the things that needed doing, to be practical, to provide what needed to be provided, to step in when their touch was needed. And then when we come to the cross, how interesting it is that the disciples, apart from St. John, have all fled. They've all run away. And yet these same women are there at the cross of Christ. They don't run away. It's not to say that they weren't frightened, that they didn't have anxiety, that they weren't under threat. Because clearly all of these followers of Jesus were suspect. And anything could have happened to any of them. And yet no, these women were there. They didn't go away. They followed. They followed from the Praetorium to Golgotha, to the crucifixion. They saw the terrible things that happened in the torture and the suffering, in the crucifixion and the death of Jesus. And yet they didn't run away. They stayed there, steadfast and confident. It's a very, very meaningful picture for us. Because we know when we look at the whole of the 20th century, and we look particularly in the former Soviet Union, that this is exactly what happened. That it was people like these women who provided for the church, who looked after bishops and priests and deacons and monks and nuns, who gave what they had, even if it was very little, who sheltered priests in their houses and risked their lives by doing it, who had secret liturgies in their houses, in the buildings for the cattle. They were the ones who, like these myrrh-bearing women, were willing to take risk and were willing to try at least to not be afraid. Of course, what these women wanted to do in the gospel, they couldn't do straight away because of the high Sabbath, because of the feast. They had to quickly bury Jesus as best they could in Joseph's tomb with the aloes and some of the spices. But they had to go away, ready to go back to finish the job with all of this costly stuff that they had bought. And of course, that's what we celebrate on this Sunday. And if we look at what they did on that first morning of Pascha, it really reflects what they did during their lives. Think of the themes that run through these myrrh-bearing women and their lives and their diaconia, their service to Christ and the apostles. The themes of love, of generosity, of devotion, supporting Jesus in his ministry, and loving Jesus in life as well as in death. Let's think of the household of Lazarus, of Mary, of Martha, of Joanna and Susanna giving that financial support. Let's ask the question, who was in the background at the Last Supper? At the table we have Christ and the 12. Who was in the wings? Who was bringing in the food? Who had done the cooking? Who took the plates away? Who tidied up? Who washed up? Well, I think we know who did that. The women disciples of Christ, who, as we've said, probably did the darning and the mending and the everyday cooking and the everyday chores. Let's reflect on this fearlessness, on this risk-taking, on this faithfulness, and on their loyalty. In Orthodoxy, we use the word vigil a lot. Vigil not simply for the service, bdenia, but vigil for being watchful, for staying watching, for staying there and keeping the eyes of the heart and of the soul open. And these women kept vigil. They kept vigil at the foot of the cross as awful things happened, as they saw Christ mocked and spat upon and tortured, as they saw the sun eclipsed, as they felt the earthquake. They didn't run away in this. They stayed there. And they faced danger. They face danger after Jesus' death in this burial. Let's not forget, as they go unaccompanied women in the dark into a cemetery, they don't know how the soldiers that they're expecting might treat them. What they are carrying is extremely valuable. These spices, it's not something from the spice shelf in Tesco's or Sainsbury's or Asda. We are talking about things, spices, probably worth thousands of pounds. Particularly when we talk about the aloes. Extremely expensive. Go and look on eBay. Go and look up agar wood, aloes wood, and see how much it costs, and you'll be astounded. We can talk about thousands of pounds for one piece of this wood, which gives such an aromatic, beautiful, beautiful scent. The women could have been robbed, they could have been mugged, they could have been attacked. They could have been targeted by Jewish zealots as Christians. And yet they went. And they went in love, and they went in devotion. But we have to be honest and say, they went without hope. And we know they went without hope by the very fact that they are taking these spices with which to bury Jesus. They don't go expecting anything other than a 3-day dead body, a 3-day dead corpse. This is what they expect. They go in fear. They go wondering, how the earth do we roll this stone away? How do we even get into the tomb? How is it going to be possible? And yet they go. And they go as people who are in the dark because the light has gone out in their world. They saw great things. Think of the confusion because of this. They saw the dead brought to life. They saw people who were blind made to see. People who couldn't walk being able to walk. People who were deaf being able to hear again. All of these miracles that they saw. What did they see just a week earlier in Bethany? A 4-day corpse, stinking, rotting, brought to life as Lazarus came out. What must they have thought in these days? They must have reflected and said, how is this possible? How have we seen all of these miracles? How have we seen our master, our teacher, our rabbi do these wonderful, wonderful things that are supernatural and showed that he has power over nature and not simply over life but over death? And now we're going with these spices to his dead body? They must have been so confused, as well as frightened, as well as feeling as though they were in the dark. But they still go. Because their love and their devotion for Jesus has not stopped simply because they saw the events on the cross. They heard him say, "Into thy hands I commit my spirit." And they saw the spear pushed into his side and blood and water come out. They saw him taken down. They were there. We see it on the Pascha on the shroud, as he's laid on that shroud, on that linen. They're there as he's laid in the new tomb, having already themselves put some spices there. They've seen all of this finality. And yet their love, their devotion, their watchfulness, their care, it hasn't decreased a single bit, even though the light has gone out and their hope has been lost. If we look in the hymns of last night's service, it brings this out. On Lord I have cried, we hear, the myrrh-bearing women came to thy tomb, and beholding the seals of the sepulchre, and not finding thine immaculate body, they came with haste, lamenting and saying, Who hath stolen our hope? Their hope had been stolen from them. Christ, their hope. And then, when we look elsewhere in the Vesper service, there's a very beautiful, poetic hymn which is put in the mouth of Joseph of Arimathea. And in that hymn, Joseph of Arimathea says to Christ, O thou who puttest on light like a garment, when Joseph with Nicodemus took thee down from the tree and beheld thee dead and naked and buried, he struck up a compassionate dirge and with mourning said, Woe is me, O sweetest Jesus, when but a short while ago the sun beheld thee hanging on the cross. It shrouded itself in darkness, and the earth quaked with fear, and the veil of the temple was torn apart. But behold, now I see thee willingly submitting to death for my sake. How shall I bury thee, my God? How shall I wrap thee with winding sheets? With what hand shall I touch thine undefiled body? Or what dirges shall I sing at thy departure? How has this happened? How is this possible? Joseph must have asked these questions. Nicodemus, who was there. All of these women. So many questions and no hope. And yet there they are, still in their love and their devotion. If we look back, can we begin to really get our minds around how these people felt? I don't think we can. If we had seen the things that they had seen in Jesus' miracles, if we had been there and heard the gospel, not as something that the deacon has read from here, but as something which has been said by Jesus before it was ever written down. If we had absorbed all of this, we had been not simply witnesses, but actors, if you like, part of the action. How would we have felt? My goodness, in our lives sometimes now, things seem grim and confusing and we can't get our heads around it. But think of these people. I don't think we can understand. Hope. It brings us to an important question. What had they hoped for? What were they looking for in Jesus? Because we know that lots of people had different ideas about what Jesus was meant to do, what they wanted him to do. We said a few weeks ago about creating a Jesus in our image who does our agenda. What was the hope? The hope for the overthrowing of the Romans, for the restoration of Israel, for an earthly kingdom? Perhaps that's part of the problem. They hoped for things, yes, that Jesus would bring, but not as an earthly kingdom. Peace that Jesus would bring, but peace in the age to come, in the heavenly kingdom. Could it be that hope was lost all the more because they were hoping for the wrong thing? They were hoping for earthly things, for political things, things to do with power, things to do with sovereignty, things to do with freedom on earth, political freedom, national freedom. The hopes could certainly have been very, very wrong. And yet, it is because these women followed with love and with devotion and didn't give up on Jesus in those terms, even though he was dead, or seemingly dead. It was because they showed that love and they were willing to go and take risks on that morning of Pascha that they rediscovered hope. They found hope. They found hope because they still loved. Their hearts were still open to Christ with love. They still felt compassion. They still went to do acts of mercy. We, of course, we know what was going on at that time. We know from the gospel. They didn't. And yet they still loved, and they still went there. Even though they had lost hope, love still burned in them. And it was love that made them willing to face danger. It was love that made them willing to take risks. It was love, of course, that had driven them to spend probably all the money that they had on these spices with which to go and anoint the body of the Saviour. The disciples, of course, well, they were hiding, we know. They were in a locked house. They were behind doors. And yet these women are the ones that go out loving and showing mercy. I like a quote that I read for the first time yesterday. It's Metropolitan Tikhon of Pskov, of course. He who wrote the wonderful book of anecdotes and collections which immortalize the Pskov Caves Lavra, the Everyday Saints book, of course. And Metropolitan Tikhon wrote, retaining love in their hearts for God, they received infinitely more than what they hoped for, both for themselves and for their loved ones, and for the living and for the dead. It was in love that they rediscovered hope. And it wasn't a hope for Jesus as a political leader overthrowing the Romans and doing geopolitical nationalist things. The hope that they discovered was that Christ was truly risen from the dead and had overcome death by death and had turned around the whole nature of life and the universe. And we can learn from this. Sometimes we feel that we have lost hope. Sometimes we have such dark things going on in our lives. We worry about jobs, about money, about family. We feel that we're in the dark. We feel depressed. We feel weighed down by so many pressures, by so many fears. Everything that they went through, except they went through far much more that we can't even imagine. But if we persevere in the love of God, and we don't give up on loving, we don't give up on being merciful, on being compassionate, on going out of the way to help other people, even people that, dare we say it, we may not be very keen on, we may find intolerable, we may not like so much. If we selflessly and fiercely pursue this life of love, selfless love, then we create the place in which we can rediscover hope as they rediscovered hope through their love. And this is how we hold on to the meaning of this Pascha. The resurrection. The resurrection not as an event in the past. As I've said to one of our sisters here, don't say Christ has risen. Please declare Christ is risen. This eternal Pascha, we hear it in the hymns, Christ our eternal and everlasting Pascha. In love, with compassion, with mercy. Let's rediscover hope. And let's rediscover the meaning of the Lord's resurrection. Not just now, not just till the leave-taking of Pascha. Every day we need the meaning of Pascha in our lives. And let's do this with love so that we can find hope. The myrrh-bearers had a reason to have lost hope. They didn't know what was going on. They saw terrible things. They thought they had seen the end. They didn't know what comes next. We do. We celebrate this feast every year. Every Sunday is a mini Pascha for us. The resurrection is the eternal meaning of our Christian lives. Yes, they had reason to lose hope, but as children of the church baptized into the Lord's death and resurrection, we do not have an excuse to lose hope, no matter how dark life gets. And all because we love God, we love Christ, and we know with our hearts, with our minds, with our souls, with our bodies, that Christ truly is risen. Christos voskresie.
Voiste nobis Christ.
Christ is risen.
He's risen indeed.
Christos anesti.
Alethos anesti.